This lesson is about the meaning of the middle voice. But first we need to know what voice is, and since there is no middle voice in English, I'm going to start with examples of active versus passive voice so that we can understand what voice is. So in the active voice, you have a subject which is doing an action. So in this case it's the Minotaur, which is our nominative subject. Eats, esthea, is a transitive verb, and it takes an accusative direct object, men, anthropous. The Minotaur eats men. That's an example of the active voice. An example of the passive voice with the same sentence is men are eaten by the Minotaur. So in the active example, that accusative direct object, men, is the object of esthea, the transitive active verb. In the passive voice, you want to take that accusative direct object and make it into the nominative subject, men. Then you change the verb into the passive, are eaten. If you want to say who's doing the eating, that subject from the active sentence, the Minotaur, becomes part of a prepositional phrase. So in the passive sentence, men are eaten by the Minotaur. Now if you look back at the active one again, the Minotaur eats men, you can change the meaning of the sentence entirely and still keep the Minotaur as subject and say, the Minotaur is eaten by men. So there we changed just the verb from active to passive. The Minotaur eats men, active. The Minotaur is eaten. And then we changed that direct object into a prepositional phrase. But notice we changed the meaning of the sentence entirely. The Minotaur is eaten by men. Is eaten is a passive voice. So now let's look at what the middle means. Remember that there is no such thing as a middle voice in English. So when we're going to translate the Greek to the English, there's no easy single translation. Instead, we have to think about what the middle voice means in Greek, and then how can we convey that in English. So sometimes the middle voice in Greek means that it is a reflexive verb. In other words, that the subject is doing something to itself. So in this example, ho pais luetai, the boy washes himself. That's what the middle voice means. By contrast, if you wanted to use an active verb, you could say ho pais, and then you could put in a pronoun that means himself, heauton, and then you could use an active verb, lue. The only problem with this is that because Greek has a perfectly good middle voice to convey just that, the Greeks would never ever ever say ho pais heauton lue. The boy washes heauton himself. Instead, they would prefer to say ho pais luetai. So that's the reflexive use of the middle voice. The middle voice can also be a voice to signal that the verb is done in the self-interest of the subject. So, for example, ho pais to athlon pheratai means the boy carries off the prize for himself, in his self-interest. You're supposed to see that middle voice verb and know that that means that the boy is taking the prize home with him. If instead you used an active verb and said ho pais to athlon phere with an active verb, instead this would just mean the boy is walking around with the prize in his hand, but it's not for himself, so he didn't win this prize. That's the difference there between the middle voice and the active voice. The third way in which the middle voice is used is called causative, which is just a fancy word that means it causes something else. So in this example, the father, ho pater, ton paida, the child in the accusative direct object. Frees, luetai. So the father sets the boy free. The father, in other words, causes the boy to go free. That is the causative sense. If you wanted to use the active, it would literally mean something like loosening the bonds around him, which I suppose a father could loosen bonds from a child, but our example we're going to use is with oxen. So the child, hopais, nominative subject, tous bous, accusative direct object, lue, loosens the oxen. So he's literally loosening the ropes around the oxen, as opposed to the middle voice one, the father causes the boy to go free. That is the meaning of the middle voice. Tune in for a few more examples in the next video.